My name's Callum Juggard. I'm a teaching fellow in philosophy at the School of PRHS here at Leeds. So my main research interests are in metaphysics and the philosophy of science. Whereas teaching-wise, as we were saying a couple of minutes ago, it's a bit all over the place.
So we're going to ask you a few questions to help people get to know you a little bit. So our first one is, how did you get into your subject area in the first place?
Mostly by accident, actually. So when I applied for university, I had no real idea of what it was I wanted to do. I applied for philosophy almost on a whim. I was told I might enjoy it, so I thought I would give it a shot. So I'm from Scotland, and Scottish universities, unlike English ones, have a 2-year pre-honours program. So the 2 years you do before the first 2 years of university are the 2 years that don't count towards your final mark. There's a bit more flexibility in the subjects that you can study there. So I thought to myself, well, I've got an unconditional offer. Philosophy sounds reasonably interesting. I'll give it a shot, and if I don't like, I've got time to change. It turns out I actually did quite enjoy it. People were right. And from there, I basically tried to find out whether I could basically hack it at postgrad level. Turns out the answer was yes. So I tried again sort of after the postgrad into postdocs. And the answer so far, thankfully, still seems to be yes.
Yeah, I also found the subject by accident too. A lot of people seem to do that, but it seems to be working out for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting the paths people take. Like my undergraduate, for example, was joint honours with maths as well. And I quickly discovered that I'm decent at maths, but I'm not a mathematician. I can do the work, but I don't have a flair for the proofs in the way that real mathematicians do. So philosophy perhaps was the better option for me.
Yeah. So following on from that, what is your main area of research? You sort of covered that a little bit, but would you mind going into a bit more, please?
Yeah, so most of my research is centered around a position in metaphysics, which is called Humeanism, after David Hume, the greatest of, perhaps second greatest, I'd like to think now, of the Scottish philosophers. One of the things that Hume is known for is a denial of what's called necessary connections in nature. The idea that things in nature don't have to come together, it's merely that they do come together. We can't perceive, at least directly, any of these necessary connections. All we perceive is that one thing happens and then another thing happens. So modern day Humeanism basically takes that as its guiding spirit. Can we construct an account of the world which doesn't require on these sorts of unexplained, mysterious, necessary connections between things? If it really is just a pattern of one thing and then another, can we get all of our usual sorts of concepts like causation, counterfactual reasoning, laws of nature, and so on? Can we get all of those out of a world that is effectively one little thing and then another? That's Humeanism, and it's come under quite a bit of attack from the philosophy of science, which is where the philosophy of science comes in. Namely that it seems to make certain claims that are hard to fit in with modern science. So one of the things I'm really interested in, and the thing I wrote my PhD on, was trying to find ways of fitting modern day Humeanism with these concerns from the philosophy of science. To what extent can they coexist? I go back and forth on how much exactly I am a Humean, but I find trying to make it fit is perhaps the most interesting part for me. And so I'm interested in all these sorts of related topics, the nature of what it is to be a law of nature, how explanation works in science, what the ontology of the world ought to be. All these sorts of related things that are at least loosely tied into the broad Humean project.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So how did you get into lecturing from that?
Lecturing specifically was pretty straightforward. So as a PhD student in Leeds, you get some teaching experience or the opportunity for that, some of which is leading seminars. And then as you become a bit more experienced, some of it is lecturing. And that's how I started. But teaching more broadly, I've been doing for a considerable length of time. My earliest memory was back in primary school. We had a shared year with the year above us. And some of the people sitting at my table, as I recall, had trouble with their maths homework, which I thought was really easy. So I remember explaining their maths to the year above me for a few weeks. Then I realized that this sort of teaching was very, very uncool during my teenage years. So I stopped doing that. I then kind of got back into it as an undergraduate in sports clubs. Been heavily involved in various sports. And because I had at least some idea of what I was doing, people would ask me, how do you do this? What should we do in these kinds of situations? So I kind of drifted into sports coaching. And from there, the move to actual teaching in classrooms was fairly straightforward, actually.
Okay. And do you have any advice for getting published in a journal?
So I'll stay away from some of the perhaps really precise technical bits of advice. Leave that to those who have editing experience. The thing I would perhaps emphasize is think about why what you're writing on matters. After all, if you think in broad terms here, the number of publications that come out within the sciences and the humanities every year is huge. A massive quantity of research every year, way beyond what any person could reasonably expect to attempt to read. So if you're contributing to that almost deluge of stuff, you might think, well, why am I doing this? Why is this particular contribution one that people should spend their times reading? And once you've got that in mind, parts of the paper ought to start to write themselves, namely part of the introduction. After all, one of the reasons that you have an introduction to the paper is to hook the reader in. Why should you care about reading this? You could other things you could do with your time, but here's a really interesting issue. If you can think to yourself why the issue is interesting and why your contribution is relevant to that, that gives you a very natural hook to start the paper, and indeed a way to justify all your other sections. They're all ways of exploring the importance of that original idea. So that's what I'd probably emphasize. If you can keep that in mind, it guides the rest of the writing. And then, of course, there are the more precise details about journals and so forth, which I'll leave to my colleagues.
Yeah, that's quite helpful, because you always think that trying to get them to like your work, but keeping your focus on that, as you were saying, sounds really helpful and useful to keep in mind.
Thanks. It's especially important in anything related to philosophy. Philosophers are trained to think of criticisms for positions and accounts, and it can get very easy to get caught in the details. I'm interested in this one little debate, and this one view in that one little debate has a slight issue. Well, yeah, sure, but all of these accounts are works in progress. No one's philosophy is finished. So why does that one problem justify an entire paper? If you can think of that broader issue, hey, you've got an answer to that, a reason someone should care about reading your work.
Yeah, that's really useful advice. Thank you for that. We've got a few more informal questions. So our next one is, what's your favourite book?
So I'm going to do what I think is perhaps a common cheat with these sorts of cases, hedge my bets. So a lot of my reading for fun is based around either fantasy or sci-fi. On the sci-fi side, I think my favorite book is one I read many years ago called The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. It's about, it's in some respects an anti-war kind of novel, where it imagines a future where we've got a means of faster than light travel, or close to light speed travel. And humanity gets caught up in a war against some alien species, and people sign up to go defend the planet and humanity and so on. But one of the main themes of the novel is the method of transportation among the stars incurs relativistic effects because you're traveling so close to the speed of light. So what the experiences of those who are out in this military expedition may only last a couple of years, but decades have passed back on Earth by the time they return. And they come back to find a world that's very different to the one they left, unable to interact really with the new society. They find themselves now signing up again. And the rest of the novel is a series of jumps in time as they become more and more disconnected from the society around them, and indeed from each other. After all, if one of you stays behind, then you may never see that person again, not just from the warfare, but because the time periods are so very, very different. And in a second respect, it made me think about the nature of conflicts in the future. So the account it has of space-to-space combat, for example, is not kind of a Star Wars-esque high-octane ships zipping around blasting each other with lasers. It's a bunch of very scared men and women sitting on a ship, unable to directly do anything themselves because it's all automated and done by algorithms, hoping that someone hasn't made a mistake in the advanced maths or missed out a decimal point, and they were all going to be vaporized because of it. What a fascinating way to think about these sorts of conflicts.
Yeah, it's ideas that I don't really see in sci-fi, so that sounds really interesting and really approaches it from a different angle.
I'd highly recommend it. It's not too long a book, so it's one of those where you think, well, even if you're not entirely sure, it's not a huge commitment either. On the fantasy side, there are very, very many books I've enjoyed. But I've got a certain fondness for one I've not touched for many years, namely the Belgariad series by David and Lee Eddings. It's not the best work of writing. It's not the most complicated or well thought through fantasy world, or the most finest bit of writing. But I've got a certain fondness from it. It's the first big fantasy series, big really classic series of books in a fantasy world I remember reading when I was younger. And it's in many ways the kind of very prototypical example of one. It's a Tolkien-esque world where you've got the hero coming out of obscurity and rising up to his destiny with a bunch of characters all almost walking out of the Lord of the Rings. But it does it in such a classic way that you can see echoes of it in many other fantasy series from then. So that perhaps is my answer on the fantasy side.
That sounds quite like a nice book, or a nice series.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question sort of follows on from the book. What's your favourite film?
Lord of the Rings. A fantastic story, as we all know. But the execution of it in the film form, I thought, was really well done. There's a whole bunch of little things people can quibble about. Oh, my favourite part was left out, or they changed that little bit there. Where's Fatty Bolgar, the other one of Frodo's friends who doesn't leave the Shire? Justice for Fatty Bolgar, and so on. But, in general, it's been done really, really well. The actors were clearly committed to it, and some of the details that they managed to stick into the film were fantastic. The way the Gandalf keeps his pipe in his staff when he's not using it on set. And indeed, some of the transmission to film form made it a little bit better than the books. After all, who really wants to sit through hours of Tom Bombadil singing at them before they get to the good stuff? Not me, for anyway. So I can forgive all of the Sauron as a giant flaming lighthouse kind of hard, heavy-handed visualization of these concepts, because the rest of it's done so very, very well.
Have you read the books as well then, for Lord of the Rings?
Yes. I read the Hobbit I pushed for in primary school as our next book, which made me very unpopular amongst my my classmates. And from there, I ended up reading Lord of the Rings and some other worlds in the wider world.
So, which of the three would you say is your favourite?
Of the films?
Yeah.
1, 3, 2. I think 1, 3, 2. The first one, there's something about the Fellowship getting together and setting off on the epic journey and so on. I struggle to put into words exactly what I find so fascinating and inspiring is not quite the right word, but captivating about it. Two perhaps suffers from being, I think, so focused on Helm's Deep, which is really well done, but the rest of the film, not a lot else happens. And Sam and Frodo are making steady progress, but they're not up to the really big stuff yet. That's why I put that as my third of the three.
Okay. So another similar thought question. If you could travel anywhere in time, where would you go and why?
So I've thought about this one. And in some respects, going nowhere would perhaps be the sensible thing, given that many other time periods have horrible diseases or be unable to speak the language or not know the customs and so on. But if we set all of that stuff aside, because that's boring, I think where would you go if that wasn't a problem? I think late medieval period, the late Middle Ages, perhaps in England in the time of Edward III. So this is around the 14th century. This is a time when things like chivalry were being really heavily emphasized. And in some respects, this was people casting their mind back to a almost mythological golden age. Oh, the time when knights were knights and men and all the rest of that, which never really existed. But they had in mind all these stories of King Arthur. They were having jousts, tournaments. This is the flowering of chivalry and so on. And of course, the 100 Years' War between England and France at the time. There were some very, very dark parts to it, of course. The periods of warfare were brutal. Serfdom was no joke. And this is exactly when the Black Death came and ravaged Europe. So there are good reasons, perhaps, to avoid this period in time. But I think seeing how some of the things I imagined as a child actually played out in reality, I think that would be really interesting.
And if you could have a conversation with any dead person, who would you choose?
I should say a philosophy here, I suppose. I certainly wouldn't have dinner with Socrates. By all accounts, the guy was an absolute pain. If you ever read the Euthyphro dilemma, you might notice that the titular Euthyphro starts off at least reasonably willing to talk to Socrates, but by the end of the dialogue appears to be trying to get away from him, willing to concede any point Socrates makes if it'll just shut him up. So maybe some philosophers are not good dinner companions. I do wonder what it would be like to have dinner with Alexander the Great. No philosopher, but educated by Aristotle, who himself would make an excellent dinner companion, I'm sure. But Alexander took the throne at around the age of 20, died in his 30s, and by that time had conquered much of the world that the Greeks knew. He had gone to the ends of the earth, as far as he and his people saw it, and only died because of illness. He thought he was going to conquer the world. Here's a man who would stop at nothing, kind of person that you'd make phrases like boundless ambition and mean them seriously. Also the almost benchmark by which many other later ancient rulers compared themselves. No matter what you've done in ancient Rome, can you ever live up to the glory that was Alexander? It'd be really interesting to talk to him and see how he looked at the world, how he thought about things. What were his ambitions? How did he conceive of himself as a person? Perhaps how would he conceive of our modern world? What would Alexander do nowadays? There's a motto.
Yeah, it'd be quite interesting to see what he'd say. Yeah.
Probably give me an army and I'll conquer it all for you. But
so our next question is, what would you tell any new students joining the university within the next few years?
Yeah, this is a difficult one, based, of course, on all the recent challenges and indeed the wider difficulties that higher education faces. Perhaps the main thing to emphasize is adaptability. We don't know really what the future of higher education is. We don't really know what the future of the world of work outside of that is. It's clearly changing from one where people might get a job and stay in a company for many years to one where you will occupy many different jobs across your lifetime. So maybe something to emphasize then is not to go in with strong, rigid ideas about what you're going to be doing 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Because unless you're in a vocational degree, such as medicine, chances are you don't know what you're going to be doing 10 years from now. Certainly I didn't when I was approaching university. I had no idea I would end up in academia itself. I'd have laughed at the idea. So you don't know what you're going to end up doing. So perhaps it makes sense then to emphasize the subjects that you find interesting. Actually go for something you have a genuine interest in, because otherwise you're going to spend a few years getting very, very bored. And at the end of it, come out with a degree that may be no more helpful to you than one you'd genuinely be interested in yourself. So in that sort of sense, pick stuff you're genuinely interested in, I suppose I would say, because as I found out, it's very, very difficult to predict how it will end up.
That's very helpful advice. Thank you for that. Our last question is relatively similar to it, but your advice may be different. So it's, what's your number one piece of advice you'd give to any student? Commit
to it, I suppose, both academically and non-academically. So the benefits on the academic side are almost obvious, right? You get a better classification of degree, you learn more, you get exposed to more opportunities, perhaps professionally, perhaps just to improve yourself, but non-academically as well. So if you think back to your earlier life, for most people, they'll look back on their earlier periods of life and think, look how carefree I was, look how few responsibilities I had, look at how easy I had it, even though I didn't realize it at the time. If only I'd, seen the forest for all the trees. That's happening even now, right? So even now, you're probably not aware of just how easy it is, how carefree it is, how lacking responsibility it is, because it never feels that way at the time, right? That's never how you experience it, but it's true. You look back on your time at university and think, I never have now as much free time as I did back then. However much I was stressed about writing essays or exams or anything like that, I had more free time and more opportunities, more freedom then than I do now. And that's probably going to be true. You'll never again have the same sort of range of opportunities available to you, the same freedom, not just in how much time you have, but in the directions you can take your life, the things you can try out and be doing. There's so many more opportunities for students than there are outside of university to try new societies, new clubs, new sports, meet new people, new styles of living, and so on. All these things are really, really hard to do and just get harder and harder as time goes on. So my top piece of advice then is to actually embrace them. Try out the thing you're scared of, the thing you're uncertain of, the thing your friend is badgering you to give a go of, and you think, I don't know if that's for me. You won't know if it's for you until you actually try it. These sorts of experiences really enhance your time at university, which at the end of the day will end up being far, far shorter than it sounds. 3 years is not that long. Students always come out the other end saying how short 3 years was. It just flashed by. Very, very few people come out the other end saying, oh, 3 years, it was such a long time. It really dragged. No one says that. So think about that. Don't waste your time here and squander it in stuff you don't really care about. Give other things a shot too, because it might turn out that's the thing that really captures your interest and perhaps even is something that stays with you for many years afterwards.
That's brilliant advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's been great talking to you both. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you for interviewing with us. It's been great.